What's up, guys, and welcome back to Moan Inc. If you guys are new here, well then, hello. My name is Erica, and it is a pleasure to have you joining us today on the channel. Because for today's video, as you can see from the title, I am chatting to one of the most famous public historians in the classics field. Today, I am chatting to Dr. Adrian Goldsworthy about his newest release, which is so beautifully sitting behind me, titled The Eagle and the Lion, Rome, Persia, and an Unwinnable Conflict. Now, today, even though, yes, we will dive into some stories I do want to pull out from this book, some quotes that I think are really interesting, and I obviously got Dr. Goldsworthy to unpack those a little bit more for you guys. This interview is not only just that. That actually, as we were chatting and we were discussing how Dr. Goldsworthy ended up in this career with his incredible, you can't say discography, but is it a bibliography? All of the books that he has published about ancient Rome and about ancient military conflicts across the board, because obviously his last release, the one before this one, was about Philip of Macedon and Alexander the Great. But we also really get into how he ended up doing all of this. I honestly got so much from that part of the interview as well, that normally I would cut a lot of those questions for you guys in editing. I normally only keep one or two, but I decided to leave all of those in because I think it's important for you guys to see just how many doors open with a classics degree and with a history degree, or at least an understanding of history and these little pockets, these little niches that other people are interested in. And so with all that being said, this interview is one that I learned a lot from and one that I'm incredibly excited to share with you guys. I obviously want to thank Dr. Goldsworthy for taking time out of his incredibly busy schedule to sit down with me for the short amount of time that he could in order to offer me this chat and offer this chat to you guys. So thank you so much, Dr. Goldsworthy. And also thank you guys so much for constantly supporting the channel, because if it wasn't for you, I wouldn't be able to have chats like this and be able to give you guys chats like this for free. So with all that being said, let's roll into the interview. So the way that I actually start all of these interviews, which is a little bit different, is that I like to hear about, and my audience also like it now because I've conditioned them to like this question, is about your classics background. So how did you get into the study of classics, and how did it lead you to studying at Oxford?
It's rather strange. I mean, I was in an old-fashioned school that still taught Latin as a compulsory thing from about the age of 10 or 11. I mean, my 10-year-old or 9-year-old son is just starting there, and they no longer teach Latin automatically. Now it's an option, but in those days it was still the old-fashioned, Kennedy Shorter Latin Primer and all this sort of thing you could look at. My father had exactly the same edition, just with a slightly different cover when he was at school all those decades before. So Latin was there from the start, but I think history's always fascinated me, and I can get interested in just about anything. But there was something growing up in South Wales. I had Caerleon not far away, where you had the amphitheatre, the legionary barracks, the museum. So it made it very real. So I think there was always something about the Romans that made them part of my history. So is that combination? I mean, I'm not a natural scholar, particularly a natural linguist. So Latin was a slog. And then I was fortunate enough when I went to do A-levels to find a school where the headmaster was a classicist from Durham and was willing to teach me Latin, even though I was the only person in the class. So I was able to do Latin A-level. When he retired a few years later, that option. So I was very, very fortunate. And I've generally been, so I knew history was always going to be there. And there's just something about the Romans, and it's partly that side, but it's also Asterix books. I love those as a kid. I spent ages drawing the little legionaries in particular. The Romans always seemed to appeal more. And then, the epics that would always turn up on the bank holiday weekends and this sort of thing. You'd have Spartacus or Ben-Hur, all this sort of thing. There's something about that spectacle, that scale, that's just intrigued me then and still does. So everything led towards the Romans in particular, but ancient history in general. And I've always been more on the history side than the literature as literature. So that's partly because I'm not a good enough linguist. It's always been blood, sweat, toil, and tears to get the Latin and Greek to a necessary standard there. But it's so there have been rare periods where they've been good enough, and I've been in practice to enjoy it for its own sake and the language. But I come back to, I want to know about the people. I want to know what happened, and I want to know why, what made them tick, how they thought. And the other great advantage of studying the Romans or the Greeks or anything like this is even at an undergraduate level or just an enthusiast, you can probably read all the evidence for a topic in a way that even if you come to the 14th, 15th century, there are so many court rolls and records and all these things, it takes far longer to get to the sort of coalface of history, of trying to understand about these people and how it all worked. So I feel you get to do proper history in a sense earlier on. I mean, the frustrating thing is there are then going to be loads of gaps in the evidence and things we can't know and where you have to guess and conjecture. So I was very lucky. I applied to Oxford, got in. Ancient and modern history was a very good course in those days. It hadn't been going that long. And whereas Greats was still very much literature, philosophy, that sort of thing, which is fine, but there were some things that wouldn't have interested me so much. I was able to go and do modern, which was mostly medieval in my case, because I thought, well, I've got Latin, let's use this. But also modern history tutors then taught in a very different way. They were really broad sweep, whereas the classics tutors had come from the Greats tradition. It was detail, it was the language. What does this word actually mean? What's the concept behind this? So to get the combination of those two approaches was a really great way to study and to be taught, because you tended to come out sort of somewhere in the middle, trying to balance all these different methods rather than just one or the other. So I hope that's helped. And then I was lucky enough to get a place to study for a doctorate, do that. And then as I was thinking I was going to be following an academic career, people started to ask me to write books, and it's just kept going from then. So I've been very, very fortunate, because essentially I'm doing and writing about the things that just interest me and that I'd want to read about anyway, and somebody's paying me to do it. So
I have so many questions leading off of that, because there's just so much to unpack there with that story. Yeah. And well, it seems, at least from your published nonfiction, I have to be honest, my dad is like a huge fan and has read all of your books. So he literally sent me like the scariest message, like every day this month has been like, when is that chat with Adrian Goldsworthy? Don't screw this one up. And I'm like, oh my God. But all the books seem to be geared at least towards military history. So, and well, a good chunk of them anyways. So what is the intrigue with military history for you? What is it about, tracking battles and finding the people underneath those?
It came from lots of things. I mean, it partly came from making FX models and things growing up and being obsessed with war films as a child, and I haven't really grown out of it altogether. But there is something, I mean, it's that thread through all of ancient history is warfare. It's what the ancient historians tend to talk about a lot. And people tend to assume that military history is really simple and you don't need to think about it. It's basically just narrative stuff. And oh, yes, they do this, they win a battle. But what's really interesting is what society's doing. And yes, I am interested in what society's doing, but actually those moments that make a huge difference do contribute. And they're not as simple as everybody tends to assume. So I think it was a mixture of that. I grew up, my parents, like a lot of the parents in the school I went to, were sort of slightly older than average, and they were just on the cusp of the Second World War generation. So they talked a lot about that. And I grew up, my father had a small shop, and small shops in Britain in those days used to acquire these old men with nowhere else to go, who liked to come in and drink tea and talk. And there were people who'd been in the Navy, in the RAF, they'd been soldiers in India. They would tell you these stories, and it was very personal. So although I haven't gone into that particular type of history, I always felt, well, in the end, we're coming back to human beings that were essentially like us, different cultures, different ideas. But if there isn't that essential humanity, if they're not lots of individuals, then we couldn't ever really understand them. They're not basically like us. You're missing something. So the military side came along, and it was something that wasn't fashionable, wasn't really being explored. So it opened up, and it was just, there weren't the books out there that I wanted to read. So I thought, well, somebody's got to do this. And yes, I mean, there's always been a military thread. It's moved on from that as I've tended to go to biographies and like, but obviously if you're dealing with someone like Caesar, a lot of it is going to be military, because that's what the man's doing. And it bothered me where you could read very good academic biographies that essentially said, well, there's 10 years in Gaul, but we're not really interested in that. And we're interested in what's happening in Rome, how the politics is going on, what he's writing back to people at Rome, and not the whole. And yet here you've actually got this remarkable Latin text written by the man who's doing all these things. And yes, of course, it's obviously very biased and it's very much, but it's someone with a great command of words. This is remarkable literature as well at the same time. So let's see what we get there, because there is a lot more material in there than people tend to allow for. I mean, I was struck, just come back to the Eagle and the Lion, the Roman Persia book, something that had never really occurred to me before is there are a lot of similarities with Crassus's campaign to what Caesar talks about in Gaul. The idea that Caesar claims Ariovistus, the German leader, has been in contact with Roman rivals of his who are dishing the dirt on Caesar and want him to die. There's similar stuff going on with Plutarch's version of what Crassus is encountering. There are the worries about negotiation. There's lots of interesting things going on that you think, well, actually, yes, it's happening on the other side of the empire, but how they're thinking about this, how they're interacting with other peoples is a lot more complicated than this simple view of, oh, yes, they go out and conquer people. There's more to it. There's a lot more to understand. And of course, the frustrating thing whenever you do the military side is that with the exception of the civil wars, or, you go back to Peloponnesian War or something, you've got at least some sense of what both sides are thinking, even if it tends to be dominated by the one version. So often when you're dealing with the Romans, you don't know what everybody else is thinking about them. Just what is it like when these Romans turn up on your doorstep? How do you deal with them? How do you understand them? What do you think they're doing? So I think there's lots more really interesting questions. And there's so much evidence that hadn't been used in that way, because Roman army studies have tended to get very archaeological, which is great. But there are questions that historians can answer as well, and ask rather, using some of that evidence in the same way. One of the other appeals is that if you study the army, you do get to look at a lot of archaeology, as well as epigraphy, as well as the literature. Whereas some fields, you've basically got your one type of source, and that's what you're doing. So it's quite nice to do all these other things and dabble, even if it means you're a jack of all trades and master of none sort of thing. At least it's quite fun to do.
Well, also when it comes to like how you discuss the military history, and we will come to the book in a second, because again, the monstrous amount of questions that I have are quite terrifying. It's like every other page I was like, what? I need to ask this question. I need to do this. But when it comes to constructing this book, the thing that I really loved about this book is how approachable and how, like, relatable is the wrong word, but as someone, because something that you say in a lot of your YouTube videos when you're promoting this book as well, is how people who are even into ancient history still don't know this little side of Rome, that it's quite a niche little area that you had to dive into. And I found it really easy to follow and follow how you write. Now, I found it really interesting when I was Googling you, and you can correct Google, obviously, if this is completely wrong. You could be like, I have no idea where you got that, but never repeat it again. But you have lots of fun hobbies. So you say riding, you also mention those in your YouTube videos, long walks, tennis, all of that sort of stuff. And I was wondering if doing all of those and coming into contact with non-nerds helped you kind of come up with the voice that you write in.
I hope so. I mean, I think even doing some of the TV programs I did a while back, where television is mostly waiting around for things to happen, and you're sitting there and you're chatting to the crew, and everybody who works in that field, they're very used to getting on with people quickly, because you work with a team and you've got to work closely, and then next week or next month you've completely different team, you've got to start again. But they're quite good in the main at building. So you just chat to people, and it's always interesting when people will suddenly say, you'll get a question, so what's this Rubicon thing? And I read in the paper, somebody's crossed the Rubicon, talking about a politician. What does that mean? And it makes you realize how many people have a little bit of classics wandering around in their head. We've picked up from various bits of culture, from references here, there, and other, or they did Antony and Cleopatra or Julius Caesar at school, this sort of thing. So they know bits, but they don't join it all together. And my aim has always been to write for anyone interested enough to pick it up. So you don't need prior knowledge. If you've got some, hopefully I say interesting things as well that maybe make you think, oh, I hadn't thought of it that way, or that's a bit different, or I didn't know that. But primarily it's also, if you've come completely afresh and you've just got, I'm quite interested in history, yeah, I'd want to know about Caesar, I want to know about Cleopatra, Alexander, whoever it is, or this topic, then you can follow. And I remember having conversation with Harry Sidebottom, who's written a lot of very successful Roman novels, one book festival where we concluded we'd both gone to the Bodleian Library to get somebody's thesis, and you have to sign them out, the old ones. And we reckoned, there were about 20 names and we knew all of them. And we'd both read this. And there is a sense when you write some academic articles that you will, if you haven't met all the people who will read this, you will at some point in your life, because it's quite a small world. And it's fun writing for the wider audience because this is interesting stuff. This is the reason we all get into it in the first place, why we all study it at any level, or we just as a hobby. It is exciting. It's really interesting, whether it's whichever angle you go to, whether it's, just liking poetry, enjoying Ovid or Virgil or whoever, whether it's aspects of the society. These are just interesting. It's fun. It's intriguing because there are so many mysteries as well. And you want to capture that. It's trying to go back to what got me interested back at the start, how I got there. And I often think I'm sort of writing for me when I was about 15, 16, before I'd done A-levels, or certainly before I'd gone to university, or me if I hadn't done that, if I'd gone off and done something practical instead. So it's trying to link it together. But, I remember, because it took a while, the first sort of popular book I wrote was a thing called Roman Warfare, which was for a 24-volume history of military history, basically. And they were coffee table books, only 40,000 words long. Now, I was given 1,000 years of Roman history to cram into 40,000 words. And I'd come from just doing a doctoral thesis where you're paranoid in terms of you're putting every little reference you can find just to cover yourself. You're thinking, what are these examiners going to say? What sort of this nervous, just, well, if I cover that, yep, that's there. I've read that. Yes, I'm aware of this article. I'm aware of it. Suddenly to go from that level of detail and that assumption that the audience knows all this stuff before you start. And also the assumption that they're already really interested. So they sort of have to read it. Whereas, we tend to criticize the ancient authors, or a lot of scholars will come along and say, well, they're not proper historians, they're writing to entertain, all this sort of thing. Well, it should be interesting. It shouldn't be hard work to read one of these texts. And yes, okay, people like Tacitus and Herodotus get carried away, but nevertheless, they're good reads. And there is a lot to be said for that. That's quite a virtue. So you can combine the two. So yes, I think it all came together as just trying to communicate. In the end, you're trying to have a conversation. It's obviously a one-sided conversation in a book, but you hope that the audience hasn't decided, oh no, I can't stand this anymore, and binned it, or just thought, oh no, and you want them, your hope is that if they're reading it on the train going to work or reading it before they go to sleep, that they actually think, oh, I'll do another 10 pages now just to get, rather than, oh yeah, let's switch the light off. We've had this for tonight. So yes, hopefully it's accessible. That's certainly the aim. And you hope each book is a bit easier to read than the last, because, you learn something about the craft of writing with each one you do, hopefully anyway. With this one, yes, it is a bit more unusual. It's a bit more niche. I'm very interested to see how this book does, because it's, write about Alexander the Great, you write about Caesar, you write about Mark Antony, Cleopatra. People know. They've already got a fairly clear idea, and it's always easier to sell a book on something that people are familiar with, and where every few years there'll probably be another one. Doing something different is always more of a gamble, because you have to rely on people thinking, I don't know that that's interesting, but let's find out and see.
Right. But, that really resonated with me as you were talking about like combining this voice, because for my YouTube channel, at least, what I do is the whole goal is to get people into classics. So I have two distinct audiences, which is students that need me to give them the answers. And then I have people that come back to it later. Yes. So for the students, I do summaries, and I do very detailed summaries of like, here's the book. It's not that difficult. Go for it. And, then the other people in chats like this, it's come back to it, buy the book, come to this little book club, and you can be part of this conversation sort of a thing. But I learned how to do that voice because I worked in a pub for like 4 years. And when I was talking to punters, I mean, the attention span is like this short. So you've got to make sure you make an impact, make it quick, try and give them a punchy line. And you're like, oh, that worked. Okay, I'm going to make a video about that one then, because that seemed interesting.
It's communication. It is a conversation. And that's the, sometimes if I go and speak in a university, people would say, oh, I'd like to do what you're doing. And then they'll tell you the book they want to write. And it's essentially it's a very academic book for an audience that knows a lot already. And thinking, well, that's fine, it's a good thing, but you can't expect someone with no background at all in, say, Victorian politics to pick this up and be able to follow it. They haven't read, that academic standard of your first chapter is pretty much reviewing the literature on the subject. I remember the first editor, well, one of the first editors I had, rather, with I think it was the Punic Wars. I did that. I did this chapter, putting it in, doing the proper academic thing. And he had me up for lunch and was sat me down to sort of break it to me gently and said, Adrian, somebody's going to read this and they'll say, who are these people? They don't know about Harris and Badian and all, they're all the names that become familiar to you as a student. You're doing the course and you're reading the stuff and you think, oh yeah, I get to know who they are. And obviously more so if you specialize in the field. But it's why should anybody know this? And it's just confusing. You're overloading them with information they don't need. You can put all that stuff in the references. It's there if they want to follow it. For that 1% or less that actually thinks, okay, yes, I do want to know. It's all there, but you don't need to throw it at them. You can get the ideas there. And you can also, the aim these days, again, it's taken me a while to sort of move out of this, but another tendency when you're writing is to think, well, I've got to sort of give all the background right at the start. But that can be desperately dull to read. Whereas if you can sort of drip feed it in a little bit here, a little bit there, okay, now we're talking about this. If it's a biography, somebody's got born, well, what are the rituals about childbirth in Athens, in Alexandria, in Rome? At what age do you get a name? All these little things. You can do that, and then you don't have to worry. You don't have to do everything in one go. So it's a learning process, but it's an ongoing conversation. And I think you don't stop learning. You keep on trying to find different ways of, again, that second, or there's seconds you've got to grab their interest. Try and get that and then lead on and then say, well, okay, that's interesting. Well, you might find this interesting because that leads on from there and so on.
What, with this book, there were so many little things that as I was reading, I was going, wait, what? I really wish that we had spent a bit more time with that because they were just like odd stories. It's this idea of capturing people's attentions with stories.
Yes.
And so I have a couple of them that I would like to ask about. So I will be quoting you to you, sure, which I know can be a bit awkward, but sorry. So
sorry, it's in, once it's in print, it's not mine anymore. It's out there, released into the wild, and whatever happens to it, it's on its own, basically.
So the first one is when we sort of hop to, in the book, around Pompeii, Mithridates VI sort of period. And on page 75, you wrote, in just over 4 years, Pompey ended wars and reshaped the Near East, spending as much time or more time in diplomacy and administration as he did actually fighting. Mithridates VI of Pontus, who had expanded his kingdom and then struggled with Rome for so long, was finally beaten and ordered a bodyguard to kill him, having famously dosed himself with antidotes for so long that he proved immune to poison. He was 57. And I want to just clarify for everybody that hasn't read, we then just move on. We then have background about why, was there a poisoning problem? Like, was he prepared for the worst? Why was he doing this to himself?
Yes, I mean, that's the when you've got a book covering 700 or so years, partly you've got to restrain yourself. Because if you put too many individuals in by name, it's just confusing, particularly as so many people from that part of the world have very similar sounding names, in the same way that Romans, you get the generation after generation, here comes the latest Sulpicius, and I remember having an indexer once in one of my books that thought everybody with the same Roman name was the same person. So you had these people who lived about 300 years cropping up in the index. But again, if you don't have the background, how are you going to know? So, but with Mithridates, yes, you're dealing. I mean, he's a wonderful character. That's a great story in its own right. But it's difficult. Yes, I mean, this is someone who's not from a happy family and a happy royal court, as is the case with most dynasts in this area and generally in the ancient world. So you have all these stories, and of course, stories accumulate around the key figures, so that you never quite know how much has been attributed to that individual or invented because that's what you should expect of a dictator, of a tyrant, of an aggressive king. But that's certainly the story. And again, it should be anyway. I can't swear off the top of my head, but it should all be there in the references if somebody wants to go off. And there should be a couple of biogs of Mithridates there. But yes, this was the story that essentially he's so nervous of being killed by his nearest and dearest that he tries to develop immunity to poison, and does it so well that when he eventually wants to take poison, I mean, you get similar stories about Cleopatra supposedly testing out poisons on prisoners to find one which, how do you look best in death, which is the least painful, all this sort of thing. And again, is that simply, as with all of these things, everybody knows she commits suicide in the end, therefore you start telling stories and embellishing it. And we never know how much sort of Hollywood stuff has gathered along the centuries into even apparently sober sources. So yes, I mean, there's, and Pompey's campaigns again are a big deal. And one of the themes of the book, which I'd always known, but it just came home to me again and again doing this, is I've worked a lot on the Roman army, I've worked a lot on Roman warfare, and you inevitably get drawn big dramatic battles, Hannibal and all this sort of stuff, and Caesar doing his thing, Alesia, all this sort of thing. But actually, when you look at the detailed narratives of most campaigns, not so much the Punic Wars, but others, people like Caesar actually spend most of their time negotiating and talking to people, because fighting a battle's risky, and you'd much prefer someone to say, oh yeah, the Romans, they've got this big looking army. I don't like the look of that. Let's just make friends with them. Let's give them what they want, be friendly, and it'll be fine. We can actually use them as friends against our neighbors over there that we've known for generations that we really hate. And if we don't make the Romans our friends, then they might make the Romans their friends and use the Romans against us. So it's that, I mean, one of the, another broader theme of the book is that it's so simplistic to talk about Roman imperialism, Roman expansion, and you turn everybody else into the world into either a sort of martyr fighting the Romans and dying, or a mere victim, or a sort of quisling that sides with the Romans. And you think, well, actually, these are people with ambitions of their own. And that's true of any of these empires that come along. There are always choices about how you deal with them. And also, many of the conflicts that occur are actually initiated by local leaders with their own agendas. And it ends up involving the Parthians or the Persians or the Romans, because it's this sort of, so it's much more complicated, and you need to return some level of initiative and agency to all these people, and not just see them as a simple part of the story and a simple sort of pro-Roman, anti-Roman. So yes, I mean, we could probably talk for an hour about Pompey and then Mithridates, and I don't mind, but that's with a book like this, it's a particular challenge, and there is a great danger with the sort of the quick pen portrait that can often sound really catchy, but isn't necessarily that reflective of the evidence. And that's a danger as well. You get carried away with the rhetoric, which, again, you could look at a speech by Cicero or Demosthenes, and it's clearly what they're doing, and they're obviously making a point as well, but they'll just either praise someone or damn someone as wonderful in a line or two, and that's all you get. It's not quite, I mean, it's almost like the sort of Homeric, the so-and-so minor hero gets introduced, given a line or two, and then, oh, dead, right, there we go, move on to the next one. Even that didn't save him from Hector's lance or whatever. It's that sort of stuff. So it's a danger, but it's a balancing act. So I'm sorry if I was overly confusing with that.
Not confusing at all, just very intriguing. Like, they're just these odd lines. That's the thing. Odd lines. I was like, where is this going? More. What's happening?
Yep, sorry.
Is there a backstory here? Like,
yes, but you're not going to get it, I'm afraid.
Well, as you were speaking, something reminded me of one of the YouTube videos, because again, I watched like all of your YouTube videos before this as well, which are really great and informative, and you don't edit them, which is amazing, because I'm someone that cuts and edits and I need to get some software so I can put in some maps and pictures and things like that. But there's stuff I'd like to talk about. But basically, it's got to fit in with looking after a small child, writing books, working, doing all the thing, running. And this was just I thought I'd have a go, see if it works. I'm too old to do social media properly, because I'm the wrong generation. I don't get it. I don't know how anyone gets the time to do this stuff. So this was, I thought, oh, well, I'll give this a try. Partly because I've been doing videos of my 9-year-old son wanted to make his channel of playing computer games. So doing that for him, I thought, oh, well, I'll give this a go and see what. So that's the only reason that's happened. But people seem to like it so far, so we'll see. It's fantastic. And I think a really good point that you made in one of the videos regarding this book was how important important it is for a historian to be unbiased when looking at wars and when looking at military warfare, which I think you did a really good job of in this book, trying to balance the two. But I think for a lot of people listening, because again, my audience are newbies, they might be wondering, like, well, how do you do that when you're reading specific kind of sources?
It's difficult because obviously nearly everything comes from the Greco-Roman side, and that's always the case. You know, you get little fragments from other sources, but if you're, say, looking at Roman expansion in Gaul with Caesar or Britain, there's nothing at all from the other side, the other point of view, other than Roman sources saying, well, and this is what the Gauls said or the Britons said or this particular, but that's it. It's always filtered through. To a very small extent, it's different in this case. You have some Persian sources in particular, some Armenian sources. You get a few traces of Parthian inscriptions and documents. There's not a lot. It doesn't compare. It is still dwarfed by the Greco-Roman side of things, but at least there's something. And really, I suppose the only time you almost get it would be, say, Josephus, when you're talking about the Jewish rebellion against Nero, where you've got the main account is written by a man who fought on both sides, or at least served on both sides. He didn't fight for the Romans, but okay. So, but obviously a man who's got all sorts of things to cover up himself. So not least the let's all commit suicide and wait till, oh, lucky, I'm one of the last pair to go, and yeah, let's change our mind. Let's not bother. Let's just surrender. So, you know, even his own narrative gives you all these sort of rather grubby elements to the story. But on the whole, you've got to face the fact, you've got to admit it, we simply know from the Greco-Roman side, and obviously we know far more about Greek and Roman society in a broader context to understand, okay, how are they thinking, you know, about geography, about different peoples from outside your empire, about simply how they fight wars. So you get a little bit, you have Shapur I, you know, these impressive inscriptions of his great triumphs over the Romans, but it's a bit like reading the Res Gestae of Augustus, and it's, you know, it's known as the Res Gestae of Shapur, because it's the same level of boastfulness. You know, Augustus is telling us, well, people come from India to submit to me, and, you know, implying therefore the Roman Empire stretches that far, which we know it doesn't. Shapur is clearly playing exactly the same game for a similar home audience that isn't going to know the difference, or even if it does, isn't going to stand up and say, excuse me, King of Kings, I don't think you really meant that. So it's, you have some bits to manage. You've got all those wonderful clay seals that survive from a fire in some sites, but of course the document that they sealed has gone. All we get is the name and the details of the official that received them. So I think what you come back to is you have to admit, yes, the sources are overwhelmingly from one side. We just get a bit from the other side. And then you get those again, very tantalizing glimpses of another empire looking towards the Parthians from the Chinese sources. But again, you know, the fragmentary, so you're sort of looking both ways, but you're not getting the main story of the people in the middle who are actually doing this and why they're doing it. I think it comes down to asking the same questions and trying to apply the same standards of reasoning and logic. And so treating the Shapur inscription just as if you're treating a Roman triumphal monument, with the same level of skepticism. Don't just say, whoopee, just for once, we've got it from the other point of view, so let's believe everything. Because when he gives numbers for the Roman armies he defeated, he's just as likely to be exaggerating as, say, Caesar is when he's talking about the Gallic armies, because that's what you do. You want your own triumph to be all the better, all the more glorious, all the more spectacular. So I think you have to apply the same level of logic. I think there's also treating the two empires as equals, because even though the Parthian Persian Empire isn't as big as the United Roman Empire, it's still huge. It's far bigger than anything else that's left out there. It is sophisticated. You know, you get all these surprises. The archaeological analysis of the Gorgon Wall up by the Caspian Sea, which has only really been conclusively proven to be Sasanian in recent years, relatively recently. And suddenly you've got this huge monument that's longer than Hadrian's Wall, but quite similar, and seems to be set up for garrisons of professional soldiers that we've always assumed the Persians don't have. But there it is. So there is new material coming out, which can at least flesh out and say, well, what we're seeing, what our sources are seeing, maybe doesn't reflect all of the experience of the Parthians or the Persians. And obviously, it's so much easier for us to say, well, the reason this emperor doesn't go off and fight a war in beyond the Euphrates is because there's problems on the Rhine, on the Danube, which we tend to know about. We get hints of similar problems in the Northeast, elsewhere in the Persian Empire. You just don't get the detail. So it's all about asking the same questions, and then you start to see the patterns. So you see how similar each side becomes over the course of the centuries, and you see them. Yes, they understand things slightly differently, but they obviously develop this etiquette for how to deal with the other, both diplomatically and then, what's a war about? What do you actually want from it? Because the striking thing is that I'd always assumed that the Romans at least must have done at some point, is you tend to assume, well, the Romans are out there conquering this big empire. They see this big, wealthy Parthian empire out there. Surely they want to conquer that as well. And when you look at the evidence, the answer is, well, no, they don't really seem to. Or if they do, they make incredibly little effort to do it. And the same from the Parthian and Persian point of view. Another expansionist power. They both seem to realize, actually, yeah, this is a bit dicey. This is a bit risky. Their ambitions are much more limited. It's more about proving that I'm better than you and I'm stronger than you, so you treat me with suitable respect. And suitable respect enough as far as my home audience in particular is concerned. And what they say back in their capital, thousands of miles away, well, who's bothered about that? So it's interesting that there are more similarities the more you look at it. And although obviously there is a danger that you are starting to see everything from a Greco-Roman framework and a Greco-Roman point of view, hopefully, again, you've got to admit these are all the things we don't know, and ask lots of questions you can't answer, and say, well, maybe this particular King of Kings is doing this because he's got problems elsewhere, or what's he actually want? More often than not, you can see this is what they actually did, so you try and deduce from that, well, what are they trying to do? Which isn't necessarily the same as how things turn out, but at least it gives you an idea. So that sense of talking all the time, of this constant diplomacy, even in the middle of major wars, let alone in the sort of the long periods of peace, and even the step back and you suddenly look and think, well, there's all these wars they fight, and the Romans go and burn Ctesiphon umpteen times, well, not umpteen times, but several times. And then you look at how many years they're actually fighting and think, well, in that century, maybe there's a decade at most when there's conflict. So the other 90 years might actually be less dramatic, but more important for telling us what's going on. So it's always that danger as well. The sources tell you about the dramatic stuff, the stuff that's worth repeating, and not necessarily what's normal.
No, of course. And something as well, like throughout this book, is that you do keep it very exciting with all of those things, like, because this book spans such a long time frame and you bring us through it so seamlessly. Because it's like, this is the interesting stuff, guys. This is the fun stuff that we're hitting. So it's very action packed the whole time. Or at least I felt like it is. Maybe I'm the wrong audience to be saying this, because I went into it curious, but I
interested. Yes, exactly.
Exactly. So I thought that it was very good in doing that. But something I think is really interesting to think about is a lot of the stuff as well that you've also mentioned in podcasts, of the stuff that you couldn't include in this book because it wasn't necessarily the most vibrant and interesting of things.
Mithridates for start.
Right? Yeah. And the other thing that you've mentioned as well in podcasts is, for example, the religion on the side of the Parthians, the Sasanians, like all of those sorts of things. So was there anything in particular that you came across with your research that you went, God, this is so good, and I've got to throw you in the bin? Like, that's not going to make it to the final book.
I tried not to. I mean, the danger always is you just get distracted. I'm doing a book on Athens and Sparta over the sort of long 5th century. So going back into the 6th at the moment, I'm researching for it anyway. And I'm just finding myself going off on all these tangents and suddenly reading stuff about archaic Greece and then thinking, well, really, I don't know enough about what's happening earlier. And I don't know enough about the Mycenaeans. And then the Etruscans, and I don't know, nobody knows that much about the Etruscans, but I've never really looked at, you're thinking, well, just because you're trying to say, well, what's happening in this century? And with this book, I tried to be more disciplined because it was a book written with a time pressure, because it sort of followed on from the lockdowns and homeschooling and all that sort of thing. So it had to be done for a deadline. But there were times when you'd be sitting there in the Institute of Classical Studies library and you'd realize you'd spent several hours and you're thinking, yeah, actually, this is great, but it isn't going to fit. And there were many more stories. I mean, and whenever you come in the course of doing something like this to a period when suddenly the sources are great, even if it's just one author, when you get to Procopius or you get to Ammianus Marcellinus, and you've suddenly got this detail, and there's so many little anecdotes in that that you just think, I'd love to put that in. But if I do, this chapter or this period is suddenly going to expand to be a quarter of the book, and I've got to cover 7 centuries. So a lot of that went. It was usually when there was just this shock of, wow, there's all this material. And whereas you realize at other points, the 2nd century is there in one chapter, and even then you're straining for information. So there's these 3 big conflicts, so little is known about them. The 3rd century, there's loads going on, but it's hard to. So there were lots like that, and there were lots of curious stories. And there are other bits, incidents that come along, and you just think, I'd like to know more about that. But if I follow it up, I can't really put it in. And some of the things, I think it would be interesting, though it's a really complicated, controversial field, to explore more about the Arab leaders and principalities and families as they develop, and from earlier on. And, there's been something in the news more recently of, I think it's released American satellite photographs showing more desert fort sites along that Roman frontier. Now, lots of them, various people have claimed to see, and there was a Catholic priest a while back who sort of documented lots of them, but people haven't found them again because of where they are. And others, there's a marvelous book from the 80s, which has photographs taken in the 1920s by the Royal Air Force, who were practicing after the First World War how to take photographs from aircraft. And there's all these nice Roman forts and features in them, because you're doing it in Syria and you're doing it in Palestine, all these areas, as it then was. And that somebody bothered to go through the archive and think, oh yeah, here we are. So there's lots of stuff like that. There's a lot more of how, another theme that would be interesting, but I just thought it wouldn't fit because you couldn't really match it from the other side, is if you looked at how the Romans are talking about the Parthians and the Persians and their concept of peoples from this part of the world, and how that influences art and literature, and how it changes as it goes along. Because part of the genesis of this book was I'd written the Philip and Alexander one. And while you were writing that and you're doing Alexander, and you're doing, obviously, the Greeks getting real experience of all these countries they didn't really know about, and that very focused story that's happening in a few years, part of me couldn't help thinking, well, okay, but what's going on? What are they thinking all those centuries later? Because they know about these places, or at least how they were and had been. And you've had the Seleucids there for a long time, reaching so far to the east. And you've had Bactria and all these places. And there has been this and there are this trade coming through. So that was tempting, because there is some interesting stuff on that. And of course, you get all those references. You end up starting to think, that this was a great problem when I did the Augustus biography, is it was so tempting to plunge into the poetry, because a lot of this stuff I hadn't read since I was an undergraduate, or even at A-level in some cases, and suddenly you've got an excuse as work to sit down and read this. But there are so many, because this is, the focus of that book is what is it telling you about society at the time, what's it telling you about attitudes to Augustus, all of this stuff. That's what you need from that point of view. But you think, well, when they mention places and peoples, when there's this Horace and Propertius and others, the Britons and the Parthians often get connected as this sort of sense of these peoples that are on opposite ends of the world, and that's all we need, and then we've got everything. This is the whole globe is Roman type thing. I don't know. It'd be interesting to trace that through in more detail as to how that develops to when you get to sort of Nero's day and Lucan, and so you have to, every now and again you've got to say, no, look, I can't do this, and I certainly can't write about it if I do it, because it's just going to distort the whole picture. And it's one thing I find with even texts I'm very familiar with and I've used lots of times. Every time you come to something, you see something new. And even the most familiar passages, because you're thinking in a different way, because what you're thinking about at that time makes you maybe, I don't know, it's just different questions, in the same way that, reading other people's books, going to other lectures, they will say something that will spark a train of thought. And often there's an interpretation. They're saying, well, I'm looking at it this way. And you think, oh, actually, that could work. Or sometimes it's this weird process that I don't think shows you're just not concentrating, but it just sparks an idea because it makes you think of something else and then goes completely off from wherever you started. But it's just a fresh way of looking at stuff you thought was very familiar. And you thought, well, surely I've squeezed everything I can possibly get out of that. But actually, I mean, it's one of the reasons why so much ancient literature has survived, although the books that have survived are because they're great literature. And great literature tends to keep coming up with all these ideas and challenges. It works because it makes you think, and because it isn't simple, and because you can't pin somebody like Virgil down and say this is very clearly what they think about Augustus or what they think about the life of a farmer or whatever it might be. There are always different ways of interpreting it. So so sorry, yes, this is what you've got to stop yourself doing, is starting to think of, hey, this is fun. Why don't I look at that? But the problem is, all of this stuff fascinates me. And it's the ancient world just keeps on, whenever you think, oh, I must have done that now, I must have done that period, you still think, actually, there are things I don't know. And there are always things you learn with each new project that you hadn't come across before, or you just never noticed. This little thing, you've read the passage, but you've been looking for something else at the time. And suddenly there it is in plain view, but it hasn't gone into your thick head or whatever. It's for some reason it hasn't registered.
I couldn't agree with that more. Like, honestly, even like going into text constantly, like I have this with the Iliad all the time. That's like my favorite book. And I've done it to death. And I have so many videos about it because I'm like, you guys don't want to read it. It's my favorite thing. So you're welcome. And every time I talk to a professor or I talk to an expert, I'm like, I'm still a dummy. I still know nothing. Everything I said beforehand was wrong. Never mind, moving forward.
But I think they all feel like that. I think deep down, you sort of have this in the background that you don't know. You're making yourself more and more ignorant as you go on, because you keep thinking, I thought I knew that. But actually, that's far more complicated. And you could read it that way, but also he could mean exactly the opposite, which, again, it comes back to the fact this has survived because it is a great piece of art. There is just so much in there. And yes, I mean, again, I sort of thought, well, when I'm doing this current book, I need to go back and just read Homer before I start, because if I'm going to do anything Greek, and there are bits where you think, well, how many times have I read this, but I don't remember that, or I've never noticed it. And it's there, it's all there. So there's plenty for us still to do. That's the good, encouraging thing.
So then, with doing this whole project, with going into Rome, Persia, Parthia, Sasanians, writing everything that you possibly can over 700 years, no exaggeration. Like, that is how far this book is going. Yeah. What did you learn most about yourself as a historian whilst you were doing that?
Oh, I don't know. As I say, there's always that, I'd never noticed that, or I'd never thought about that. Sometimes it's the little things. I mean, you have this late 6th century AD manual, the Strategicon, that's attributed to the Emperor Maurice, but may have been written by him, may have been dedicated to him. And again, mentioned horse riding earlier. You get the stirrup is mentioned twice. Once just everybody should have one of them. And then the other one is that if somebody's wounded, the medic can put the 2 stirrups on one side, so he can put one of his feet in one, and the wounded man can ride sort of in front of him and be held up with his foot in the other. And, you can go back particularly to 19th century history, and the introduction of the stirrup was this epoch-making change in how everybody fought wars and rode horses and all that sort of thing. And certainly, as someone who doesn't like riding without stirrups, I'm happy with them because that's how I've learned. And I'm, yes, I'll do the other stuff because you've got to sometimes, but I'm middle-aged. I don't want to fall off. I like that comfort blanket that they offer. But it's things like that where, again, it hadn't jumped out to me. So I think it's often the little things. It's the reminder of how many things there are I've yet to learn about. Because this wasn't, I'm not an expert in Parthian or Persian stuff. It was fun to do because it meant I was reading lots of stuff I'd never read before, as well as going back to things I did know and asking different questions. So I think it reminds me that there's lots more to learn. There's lots more different ways of looking at the same evidence. And I haven't written a book with such a broad time span for a long time. And it does force you to think in a different way because, you do a biography, it's fairly simple. Somebody's born, they grow up, they do stuff, they die. and your pattern, your sort of plan for the book is there. It's very simple. With something like this, you had to be much more selective, and it was different to going back doing that coffee table book all those years ago. But it was that sort of feel. It was good training of how to tell the story, how to explain the story, and how to, I don't know, make it all work and make it all say something useful. But I'm generally, I quite like the detail. I quite like the day-to-day stuff. I quite like, one of the things I've always wanted to do whenever I've written a biography is try and say, well, this is where that person is at that time. Because sometimes you just forget and you think, so when I did Augustus, it had never sunk into me that he actually spends most of his life as ruler away from Rome, and certainly away from Italy. And he travels a lot. Now, for me, I've grown up probably because it's, Hadrian's Wall and all this sort of stuff, emperor who comes to Britain. Hadrian's the great traveler. Everybody else just sits in Rome and waits for people to come to them. This is a problem. Please, can I have a solution to this, Caesar? You go back and you suddenly look and you think, oh, that's actually completely different. And things you take for granted, like the imperial women traveling. You go back and suddenly you look at the Republic, and the idea that a senator's wife would go off to his province with him would just be unimaginable. So it's simple things like doing the Caesar book all those years ago. People say, oh, well, what's going on with Caesar? Is Caesarion his son? Because after all, he's married to Calpurnia, best part of a decade, they don't have children. But they're not together. They're not in the same country for about 10 years. What do you expect? I mean, it's that sometimes these very practical things, what they're doing. And with Alexander, you think, oh, yeah, he might have all these plans for what this empire is going to be. But actually, he spends most of his life traveling and fighting a lot of the time. But he's on horseback. He's marching. He's maybe traveling in a carriage sometimes. That's a very different sort of life to somebody who's got time to sort of sit down with a think tank and consider, what sort of political system do we want for this empire? How shall we relate to the Persians? All this sort of stuff. Sometimes I like to come back to the practical, the very human side of things. Now, that's much harder in a book like this where you can't follow any individual for very long. So I hope this is a way of sort of still having an element of that, but also having the longer perspective. But it did mean some of the big debates in ancient history, like the causes of Roman imperialism, what the Roman frontiers are for. When you look from a distance, and perhaps that's distorting, you actually think, well, it's pretty simple, isn't it? This is what they do. It seems fairly logical. They've decided this is what they're going to try and do. This is what they're not going to try and do, and they get on with it. So I don't know. You spend a lot of time with a book and you can't get it out of your head. And then you finish and, I've been checking copy edits of another book today, and you've suddenly got to confront something you wrote months ago, and that brings you back, but you've moved on to the next one. So your mind is shifting to that. And it's this concept, but you hope you write each one a little better, you communicate better. And it comes back to that conversation. And you're relying not just on the people, hopefully there are enough people that read Adrian Goldsworthy books, come back and buy the next one and think, oh, I enjoyed the last one by him, maybe this is worth a shot. But also the people who've never heard of you, or have no idea you did this sort of thing, or because I write some novels as well, they've read those, have no idea whatsoever you're a historian, and vice versa. You hope that you can still intrigue them. You can still get that couple of seconds at the bar or whatever it is. There's back to that experience that they think, oh yeah, that is interesting. I would like to know more. Maybe this is worth a go. And hopefully that they enjoy it, and then they gain an interest in this, because the subject isn't going to survive if nobody follows it, if nobody's interested, if nobody cares anymore, because it's not, as I say, I was probably the last generation to go through a school where Latin was compulsory. And it's just not the case anymore. Most people, an ancient history, they might do a bit in primary school on Roman Britain, but that's it. So you want, they need to know, because even if, apart from the value of the subject itself, if you're going to understand any literature or art beyond very recent stuff, you need to know about Homer. You need to know about the gods, the goddesses, you need this stuff. You need it's so fundamental to so much culture that follows that you'll be missing it. And I fear there's a danger that you'll reach a point where people won't see it because they just don't know it's there. So they'll just assume it isn't there and it isn't important if it is. And that would be a shame. as far as I'm concerned. So
the question I always end on,
Mm.
even Dr. Goldsworthy, is a
Mm.
piece of advice. Because again, my audience are newbies. And for those that
Yep.
stick around to the end of an interview, I like for you to basically speak to them.
Yep.
Now, as somebody who has been in public history for so long and discussing, you know, the idea of having a conversation with the reader or at the bar or whoever it is, for these people that are getting into it and that are getting excited with ancient history and want to pass that on, what's the advice that you would give to them about communication?
It's remember why you find it fun. You know, what makes it interesting to you? Because there's a tendency you're learning and you're thinking, oh, I'm learning stuff and this is quite serious, to dress it up and say, okay, I'm talking about the Iliad. You know, this is the first piece of Western literature. You know, it's and it is this great epic that has influenced so many people, that influence cultures, the decision making. You know, when you have people like Cicero deciding what they're going to do in the course of it, in the build up to a civil war, on the basis of Homer, you know, what should I do? What's my reputation? How should I behave? Then this is big deal stuff. So it's easy to get carried away, but just remember why you thought, hey, what's that about? What's interesting? So it's always good to think of those little things that sparked your interest, whether it is a reference to, you know, you come across somebody talks about the Ides of March or the Rubicon, or they talk about, you know, the anger of Achilles or something like that, or the Trojan horse even, and just go from there. And again, it's fun. It doesn't need to be dull. You know, academics have to do things in a sober way because that's the method they've got to do it. But they got there because at some point, probably as a child, something clicked in their head and thought, wow, isn't that really interesting? And aren't these people fun? Because as a friend of mine once said, whatever you say about the Greeks and the Romans, they might not be the nicest people to live next door to, but they're never dull. You know, there's always exciting stuff. There's so much when you read it that is desperately human. You know, they talk about so many problems and issues, and it's there. Yes, Homer is talking about these warrior aristocrats with their sense of competition, of honor, of personal reputation, and you know, the violence in it is as gratuitous as anything Tarantino's coming out with, but it's very real. You know, they are still people, and there are these concerns of, you know, do I really want to do this? And, you know, shall I have a quiet life and go off but not be famous? And what? But there's so much life as well as death in it. And it's so much that people can read. And, you know, there was that whole trend in America not long ago of people writing Vietnam veterans saying they were finding from Homer ways of understanding their own experience. Now, whether all their interpretations are right or not, the point is it spoke to them. Something from all those thousands of years ago has reached people and helps them to understand their lives. So it is important. It does have loads of big ideas, but it's also fun. You know, it is exciting. There is just, and it is so full of such good stories and such larger than life characters, whether in the literature, but also in the history. These people that you couldn't make up, that if you wrote into a story, people would say, oh, come on, you know, nobody's going to do that. But they did. It's so, I think it's that, share your own joy in it, share your own wonder, your intrigue, because it's all there. And there's a good chance the reasons that got you excited will get them excited as well. Because it's not for everyone, perhaps, but it is for a lot of us. You know, there's a lot there, even if it's just as a, oh yeah, I'm quite interested in that for a bit. It is all there.
It goes without saying that you guys can find all of Dr. Goldsworthy's publications, his links to his YouTube, his website, and everything in the description below. So if at any point you guys wanted to buy The Eagle and the Lion, you guys can find that super easily down there. But also, again, links to everything else that we discussed in this interview will all be down there. So do not forget to check that out. So thank you guys so much. And we'll be seeing you next time with more videos here on Moan Inc. I'll see you guys then.